John Harris had always been a man of routine. For the better part of his 70 years, he had followed the same patterns, worked the same long hours, and lived a life dictated by deadlines and expectations. His professional world, a successful career in finance, had shaped him into the person he was today. He had always been focused, driven by a desire to achieve, climb the corporate ladder, and secure his family's future. But on the morning of his 71st birthday, something was different. It wasn't just the calendar flipping over to a new year of his life. It was something more profound, a shift he couldn't quite put into words but could feel deep in his bones. John had been to see his doctor for an annual checkup, a routine he'd been following for years. But this time, the results were different. As he sat in the sterile, white-walled office, listening to his doctor's words, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. His doctor, Dr. Emma Levine, looked at him over the rim of her glasses and spoke with the kind of gentle seriousness that only a physician with years of experience could muster. She mentioned that his blood pressure was higher than it should be, that his cholesterol levels were concerning, and that his overall health wasn't as robust as it should have been for someone his age. "John," she said, her voice calm yet firm, "you've lived a long life, but there are choices that you're making now that will determine how the next decade or two will unfold. You need to take care of yourself. I'm telling you this because I care about your health. You have to be proactive about making changes now." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had always considered himself healthy enough. He was still active, had never been a smoker, and had kept a somewhat balanced diet. But the truth was, over the years, he had neglected the very things that his doctor was talking about. He had taken his health for granted. He had ignored the subtle signs of wear and tear on his body, believing that if he just kept pushing forward, he could outrun the inevitable decline that came with aging. But in that moment, John realized that ignoring the problem wasn't a solution. He had to face the facts. As he left the doctor's office, the weight of her words lingered in his mind. For the first time in a long time, he began to reflect on his life and the choices he had made, choices that had led him to this point. He had spent the majority of his adult life dedicated to his career. His job had always come first, followed by the demands of raising a family, managing a home, and maintaining the social obligations that came with his position in the business world. But in all that time, he had neglected to prioritize himself, his health, and his happiness. He thought back to his younger days, when he had been full of energy and ambition. There was a time when he had played tennis on weekends, taken long hikes, and even dreamed of running marathons. But those activities had slowly faded as the years went by. He remembered how, over time, the days had turned into months and the months into years, and he found himself working longer hours, skipping workouts, and grabbing fast food on the go. The consequences had begun to show up in his body, in the form of excess weight, stiffness in his joints, and a general sense of fatigue that never seemed to go away. But it wasn't just physical health that John had neglected. It was his mental and emotional well-being as well. John had spent so much time focusing on the future, on what he needed to achieve, that he had forgotten how to live in the present. He had pushed away the people closest to him, prioritizing work over relationships. His wife, Linda, had always been supportive, but he had noticed the subtle distance between them in recent years. They had stopped having the long conversations they once shared, and the spark in their relationship had dimmed. He had become so caught up in his professional world that he had neglected the emotional nourishment that came from his family and friends. The more he worked, the more isolated he had become. His children, now grown, lived in different cities and had busy lives of their own. While they still spoke on the phone occasionally, he realized he had become more of an occasional visitor in their lives rather than an active participant. He had missed birthdays, anniversaries, and other important milestones. His children had always understood, or so he thought, but now, as he looked back, he could see the years of missed opportunities, missed moments that he could never get back. It wasn't just his physical health or his relationships that had been neglected. It was his own sense of purpose. He had spent so much time chasing success that he had forgotten what it meant to live a life that was fulfilling beyond work. John had never really taken the time to pursue the things he was passionate about. His love for art, for example, had been relegated to the background. He had always enjoyed painting when he was younger, but had never found the time to pick up a brush as an adult. His guitar, which had once sat in the corner of his study gathering dust, had been a dream he had abandoned long ago. There were books he wanted to read, hobbies he wanted to try, and places he wanted to visit. But all of those things had been sacrificed for the sake of work. That afternoon, after leaving Dr. Levine's office, John took a long walk through the park near his home. He didn't know why he chose that particular park, but it seemed to offer him a sense of calm in the midst of the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. As he walked, he watched the children playing on the swings, the older couples sitting on benches holding hands, and the joggers passing by with a sense of purpose. The world around him was moving, and he realized that life was moving without him if he didn't act. He had spent so much time living in the future, in the next big deal, the next project, the next paycheck, that he had forgotten to live in the present. He had been so focused on what was coming that he had missed the beauty of what was already here. He knew he had to make changes, but where did he even start? The thought of reversing years of neglect seemed daunting, almost impossible. But as he continued walking, he made a decision. It was time to take control of his life again. He was no longer willing to let time slip away without taking action. For the first time in years, John felt a spark of hope. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew that if he didn't make a change, he would regret it for the rest of his life. When he returned home that afternoon, he sat down with Linda and told her about his visit to the doctor. She listened attentively, offering her support and understanding. John realized, in that moment, that he wasn't alone in this journey. Linda had been there for him all along, even when he hadn't been present for her. Together, they made a plan to prioritize their health, reconnect with each other, and start living a life that was more than just about work. As John lay in bed that night, his mind was filled with new possibilities. He no longer viewed aging as something to fear, but as an opportunity to embrace the next chapter of his life. The wake-up call he had received that day wasn't just about his health. It was about his life as a whole. He had been given a second chance to live with intention, to pursue his passions, to rebuild relationships, and to prioritize the things that truly mattered. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. He had spent his life waiting for the right moment, and now, at 70, he realized the right moment was now. It was time to stop putting things off and start living. The journey wouldn't be perfect, and there would be challenges ahead. But John was determined to make the most of whatever time he had left. He had been given a wake-up call, and he was ready to answer it. After the wake-up call from his doctor, John Harris began to reflect on his lifestyle in a way he never had before. Health had always been a secondary concern for him. He had been fortunate enough not to experience any serious medical conditions up until that point. Like most people, he thought that being healthy meant not getting sick, but he now understood that health was more than just the absence of disease. It was about taking care of the body proactively, and John had been neglecting that responsibility for far too long. The first thing he did after that fateful doctor's appointment was take a hard look at his daily routine. His entire life had been about schedules and productivity, but in his quest to be the best at his job and provide for his family, John had disregarded the most important element of his life: himself. For decades, he had operated on autopilot, going through the motions of his demanding career, meeting deadlines, attending endless meetings, and focusing solely on achieving more. While his career had brought him success, it had also come at a heavy cost to his physical well-being. He didn't get enough sleep, ate poorly, and seldom exercised. He'd convinced himself that he could get by on caffeine and adrenaline. But after hearing his doctor's blunt assessment, John realized that this way of life was no longer sustainable. One of the first changes he made was to address his eating habits. John had always prided himself on his ability to manage a busy workday with minimal effort. Breakfast was usually a hurried cup of coffee, lunch was something he picked up from a fast food joint or the corner deli, and dinner was often eaten in front of the television, leftovers from the night before. He knew deep down that this was a poor approach to nutrition, but the convenience was hard to resist. He had spent years making excuses, telling himself that he didn't have time to cook or to sit down for a proper meal. But now, with the threat of health complications looming, John realized he couldn't afford to continue down this path. The decision to overhaul his diet was not easy. Old habits die hard, but he knew it was essential. He began by cutting back on processed foods and sugars. Instead of grabbing fast food during his lunch breaks, he started bringing his own meals to work. Initially, it felt like a hassle, but he quickly found that preparing meals ahead of time made him feel more in control of his health. He discovered the joy of cooking and started experimenting with healthier recipes. His dinners, once quick and uninspired, became vibrant, full of vegetables, lean proteins, and whole grains. His energy levels improved, and he noticed he didn't feel the mid-afternoon slump that had once been a constant. It wasn't just about what John was eating, though. It was about how he was eating. Before, he had been so busy that he barely took time to enjoy a meal. He would eat while working, barely noticing what he was consuming. Now, he began taking time for his meals, sitting down at the table and savoring each bite. He found that eating mindfully not only helped with digestion, but also allowed him to reconnect with the pleasure of food. Food no longer felt like a mere fuel source for his body. It became a source of joy and nourishment. As the weeks passed, John noticed subtle but significant changes in his body. He was losing weight, his skin was clearer, and he felt more vibrant. But the most noticeable change was in his mood. He no longer felt the irritability or low energy that had become the norm for him in the past. His diet wasn't a cure-all, but it certainly played a significant role in improving his overall sense of well-being. The next thing John focused on was exercise. For years, he had avoided it, convincing himself that his busy lifestyle didn't allow time for physical activity. He used his work commitments and family obligations as an excuse. He'd once been an avid runner in his younger years, but as his career took over, he gave up those activities. In fact, he couldn't remember the last time he'd gone for a jog or done any sort of structured exercise. His body, once agile and strong, had grown stiff. His joints ached, and he often found himself short of breath after climbing a few flights of stairs. Now, as he took stock of his situation, he realized that this had to change. He couldn't continue to ignore his physical condition and expect to feel good. So, he made a plan. John knew that he wasn't in the best shape, and he wasn't trying to push himself to run marathons or lift heavy weights at the gym. Instead, he started with simple, achievable goals. Every morning, he would go for a walk around the park near his house. The first few days, it was a struggle. His legs were stiff, and his body felt tired from the lack of movement, but he didn't give up. Slowly but surely, walking became a routine, and he began to feel the benefits. His breathing improved, and he no longer felt the fatigue that had been a constant companion in his day-to-day life. After a few weeks, John added more variety to his routine. He started to incorporate light stretching and yoga into his mornings. His muscles, which had grown tight from years of inactivity, responded well to the gentle stretching. He could feel his flexibility improving, and the tension he had carried in his shoulders and lower back began to fade. Though he had initially felt embarrassed by his lack of fitness, he began to embrace the process. Each day was an opportunity to improve, and he celebrated the small victories. John's commitment to exercise grew over time. He found himself looking forward to his morning walks and yoga sessions, relishing the time spent moving his body. As his stamina improved, he challenged himself further by increasing the length of his walks and introducing more intense workouts, such as cycling and swimming. While it was never easy, John was committed to making exercise a permanent part of his life. He understood now that physical activity wasn't just about losing weight or improving appearance. It was about maintaining strength and flexibility as he aged. It was about making sure he could continue to do the things he loved without limitations. Sleep was another area John had neglected for years. He had always been a night owl, staying up late to finish work or to catch up on emails. Even on weekends, he would stay up late, reading the news or watching television, telling himself that he could catch up on sleep later. But as he got older, John realized that his sleep patterns were affecting his health in ways he hadn't fully understood. He was waking up tired, dragging himself through the day, and relying on coffee to stay awake. His mind was foggy, and he often felt irritable, snapping at Linda or his colleagues without reason. John decided to make sleep a priority. He started by establishing a bedtime routine, turning off screens an hour before bed, and avoiding caffeine in the afternoon. He created a more relaxing sleep environment, dimming the lights, using soft music, and investing in a new mattress. At first, it was hard to adjust. His body was used to staying up late, and his mind had a hard time winding down. But as time went on, he began to fall asleep faster and wake up feeling more refreshed. He discovered that when he slept better, he had more energy during the day and felt more positive overall. Over the course of several months, John saw dramatic changes in his health. He had lost weight, his energy levels had skyrocketed, and his mood had improved. He had learned to prioritize his physical well-being and had created a routine that worked for his lifestyle. But the changes weren't just physical. They were mental and emotional as well. He felt more focused, more patient, and more present in his relationships. His marriage to Linda had deepened as they worked together to maintain healthier habits, cooking meals together, taking walks, and sharing quality time without the distractions of their busy lives. John knew he wasn't out of the woods yet. Maintaining good health required constant effort, but he was willing to put in the work. He understood now that health wasn't something you could take for granted. It was something you had to nurture. The benefits of this new lifestyle were immeasurable, not just in terms of physical well-being, but in how he approached life as a whole. By making his health a priority, John had unlocked a new sense of purpose and joy. It wasn't just about living longer. It was about living better. He was more engaged in his own life than ever before, and he knew that if he continued down this path, he would be able to enjoy the years ahead with strength, vitality, and a deeper appreciation for the small things that made life worth living. After years of chasing professional success and barely seeing his family, John Harris woke up to the realization that time had passed him by. His children, once young and living under his roof, were now adults with families of their own. His relationship with his wife, Linda, had cooled over the years, not out of any particular conflict, but from the steady erosion that happens when people take each other for granted. His social circle had narrowed, limited to colleagues and acquaintances with whom he only shared work-related conversations. The more John focused on his career, the more isolated he had become, without even fully recognizing it until his doctor's warning had forced him to confront his life in its entirety. It was time to rebuild the connections that had fallen by the wayside. John's first step was to reconnect with his wife, Linda. She had always been his rock, supporting him through the highs and lows of his career. But over the past few years, they had drifted apart emotionally. They had both become so preoccupied with their own worlds that they stopped sharing them with each other. At night, after a long day of work, John would collapse in front of the television, scrolling through the news or responding to work emails, while Linda quietly read her book or scrolled through her phone. There was no fighting, no anger, just a quiet kind of distance that had settled between them. One evening, after a particularly productive day where he had started making changes to his lifestyle, John realized that he missed the conversations he and Linda once had. They used to talk about their dreams, their travels, and the things they hoped to achieve together. He decided to take a step forward and initiate a real conversation with her, one that wasn't about their children or the house or the things that they needed to do, but one that was about them as a couple. That night, after dinner, he put down his phone and turned off the television. He looked at Linda, who was sipping her tea on the couch, and said, "Linda, we need to talk. I know, I've been distant, and I've let everything else take priority, but I want to reconnect with you. I don't want to let another year go by without really being present for you." Linda looked at him, surprised by his sudden openness, but her face softened. "I've noticed, John. I know we've both been busy, but I miss us. I miss talking about things that aren't just about the day-to-day grind." For the next hour, they sat on the couch and talked. It wasn't an easy conversation at first. There were awkward pauses and moments of vulnerability, but they slowly found their way back to each other. They talked about their hopes for the future, things they wanted to experience together, and how they could start being more present in each other's lives. It was the first real conversation they had in a long time, and both of them felt a weight lifting from their shoulders. Over the next few months, John and Linda made a conscious effort to spend more time together. They began scheduling regular date nights, something they hadn't done in years. At first, it felt strange to be out on a dinner date after decades of marriage. But as the evenings unfolded, they rediscovered the joy of simply enjoying each other's company without the distractions of daily life. They shared meals at their favorite restaurants, took walks through the park, and even revisited some of the hobbies they had enjoyed in their younger years. One weekend, they went hiking in the mountains, something they hadn't done since their early marriage, and it was as if they were falling in love all over again. They found that by setting aside time for each other, they were able to strengthen their bond and build a deeper, more intimate connection. John realized that it wasn't just about the grand gestures. It was the small, everyday moments that mattered most. It was the conversations over a cup of coffee in the morning, the quiet walks after dinner, and the laughter they shared over the smallest of things. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real, and by actively nurturing it, they were able to rediscover the foundation of love that had always been there. Rebuilding his relationship with Linda was only the beginning. John also realized that he had neglected his relationship with his children. His adult children, Sam and Emily, were busy with their own lives, and while they kept in touch through occasional phone calls, John had missed out on so many of their milestones. He had been a good provider, but he had never fully participated in their lives the way he should have. The guilt of that realization weighed heavily on him, and he knew he had to do something to change it. One afternoon, John called Sam, his son, who lived in another city, to ask if he could come visit for the weekend. "I know I haven't been the best at keeping in touch, but I'd really love to spend some time with you. Let's do something together, just the two of us." Sam, who had always been understanding of his father's work commitments, was initially surprised but warmly agreed. When John arrived in Sam's city, they spent the entire weekend doing things they used to enjoy when Sam was younger, going to ball games, visiting old spots they used to frequent, and reminiscing about the past. It was a weekend filled with laughter, stories, and genuine connection. Sam shared stories about his own family, his career, and the challenges of adult life. John listened intently, no longer just as a father, but as a friend. They didn't talk about work or the pressures of life. Instead, they spoke about the things that mattered: family, dreams, and life's ups and downs. For John, it was a revelation. He had spent so many years being distant, thinking that providing financially was enough. But now, he saw that being present, emotionally, mentally, and physically, was what his children needed from him. By spending quality time with Sam, he had regained a sense of closeness that had been missing for too long. And it wasn't just about catching up. It was about being an active part of his son's life once again. After the visit with Sam, John made it a point to call Emily, his daughter, and ask her to visit. Emily, who lived with her husband and 2 young children, was delighted at the idea. She, too, had noticed the distance between them, but had never said anything, understanding that her father's work often took precedence. But now that he had changed his priorities, she welcomed the opportunity to spend more time together. When Emily came to visit, John made an effort to connect with her in a way he hadn't before. They took trips to the zoo with his grandchildren, had long talks over dinner, and even baked cookies together, something they used to do when she was a child. It wasn't about grand gestures, but about showing up, being present, and creating new memories. John learned that the more he was involved in his children's lives, the more he felt a sense of fulfillment. It was a type of wealth he had never fully understood until he had it back, the wealth of family. As time went on, John realized that reconnecting with his loved ones wasn't just about spending time together. It was about building new habits, new routines, and new traditions. He made a conscious decision to be present for his family, to be the father, husband, and friend he had always wanted to be. He sent Sam texts just to check in and started weekly video calls with Emily to see how the kids were doing. When he and Linda went on their walks, they invited the children to join them whenever they were in town. This renewed sense of connection was not just about the quantity of time spent together, but the quality. John had learned the hard way that it wasn't enough to simply be there physically. He had to be emotionally available, attentive, and present. And as he worked to rebuild these relationships, he found that not only did his bond with his children deepen, but his entire outlook on life shifted. John had spent so much of his life working for a future he thought would bring happiness. But now, as he looked around at the people who mattered most to him, he understood that the true wealth of life wasn't in accolades or financial success. It was in the relationships that anchored him, that nurtured him, and that made life meaningful. With each step forward, John not only rebuilt the connections he had lost, but he also discovered a new depth of love and appreciation for the people who had always been there for him. As John reflected on his journey, he knew that his life wasn't perfect, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was living it with intention. He wasn't just going through the motions. He was actively shaping his future with the people he loved. And that, more than anything else, was the greatest gift he could give himself and his family. John Harris had always prided himself on being a man of routine. His life had been a carefully constructed series of tasks. Wake up early, go to work, meet deadlines, take care of the house, and be there for his family when needed. But now, after years of being trapped in the cycle of predictable day-to-day activities, something had shifted. He had begun to realize that life, at least the part of it that truly mattered, wasn't just about surviving each day. It was about living fully, embracing new adventures, and being open to the unexpected. This new way of thinking was not easy for John. After all, he had spent most of his adult life putting off his dreams for the sake of responsibility. He had sacrificed his passions for his career, had shelved his desires for the security of a steady paycheck. Traveling the world, pursuing hobbies, or even exploring his interests seemed like things that could wait until later. But now, in his 70s, John was beginning to understand the true meaning of time. The days stretched ahead of him. Yes, but there was no guarantee of tomorrow. What was he waiting for? Linda had been the catalyst for his shift in thinking. After their heartfelt reconnection, the two of them began to talk more openly about their dreams and what they wanted from the years they had left. They didn't want to look back and feel like they had wasted any more time. One evening, over a glass of wine, Linda brought up a conversation they had once had years ago, before their lives had been consumed by work and family responsibilities. Do you remember when we talked about visiting Italy? It was one of those things we always said we'd do someday, she said, her eyes glinting with a quiet excitement. Maybe it's time we actually do it. John had almost forgotten about their conversation. It had been a dream, a distant possibility, a vision that never seemed to materialize because life always had other plans. But now, sitting there with Linda, the idea of finally visiting Italy, experiencing its history, its culture, its food, and its art felt like something that could actually happen. The more they talked about it, the more they realized that they weren't too old to chase those dreams. They weren't too tired or too set in their ways. They could go to Italy. They could make this happen. But the trip to Italy wasn't just about the destination. It was about embracing a new mindset. John had been someone who had lived in the world of logic and practicality, someone who had often calculated every move, weighed every risk, and avoided unnecessary uncertainty. It had served him well in business, but it had kept him from truly experiencing life in its fullest form. What John needed was to embrace uncertainty, to let go of the need for control, and to see where life would take him. As soon as they returned from their conversation, John began making plans. He didn't want to waste any more time. He and Linda researched flights, looked at places to stay, and started mapping out their itinerary. It wasn't the elaborate weeks-long adventure they had imagined in their youth. It was a shorter, more practical trip that still promised the thrill of experiencing something new and exciting. They settled on a 2-week tour of Rome, Florence, and Venice, visiting the landmarks they had always dreamed about but never seen. The Colosseum, the Vatican, the canals of Venice, the art museums of Florence. They would stay in charming hotels, eat at local trattorias, and take in the sights and sounds of Italy, living as locals did for just a short while. As John looked at the itinerary, he felt a sense of excitement that had been foreign to him for many years. He had spent so long focusing on what he had to do that he had forgotten what it felt like to want something, to dream of new experiences, to feel the anticipation of something on the horizon. The trip to Italy represented more than just a vacation. It was a symbol of everything he was beginning to embrace. It was about living life with intention, taking risks, and seeking out new adventures. In the weeks leading up to their departure, John's mindset shifted even further. He started to notice that he had spent much of his life avoiding the unfamiliar, the unknown. He had been cautious, not wanting to step too far outside of his comfort zone. He had never taken up hobbies that required skill or patience, like painting or learning an instrument. He had never gone on spontaneous trips or explored new activities. But now, with the prospect of Italy on the horizon, he felt emboldened. He joined Linda in trying new things. They started a beginner's painting class together. They took a cooking course, learning how to make traditional Italian dishes like fresh pasta and risotto. They signed up for a wine-tasting experience, learning about the intricacies of Italian wines and the art of food pairing. These small steps were all part of a larger shift in how John viewed his place in the world. He no longer saw himself as someone who was too old to try new things. He saw himself as someone who was just getting started, as someone who still had so much to experience. It was an exciting and liberating realization. It felt as if the world had suddenly opened up to him in a way it never had before. The beauty of life wasn't just in the places you went or the things you did. It was in the willingness to embrace them fully, to dive into the unknown with curiosity and enthusiasm. The trip to Italy itself was everything John and Linda had hoped for and more. They wandered through the cobblestone streets of Rome, marveling at the grandeur of the Colosseum, standing in awe beneath the Sistine Chapel's ceiling, and savoring the taste of fresh pasta in a small trattoria tucked away in a quiet alley. They spent hours in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, gazing at the masterpieces of Botticelli, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci. They sat in the sun beside the canals of Venice, watching the gondolas glide by, feeling the cool breeze on their faces. Every day was an adventure, full of new experiences, and every moment was an opportunity to create memories that would last a lifetime. The trip was also a moment of profound self-reflection for John. He realized that he had been holding back from truly living because he had been afraid of failure, afraid of the unknown, afraid of the messiness of life. But now, in his 70s, he understood that life wasn't something to be feared or controlled. It was meant to be embraced with all its chaos, beauty, and unpredictability. By stepping outside of his comfort zone, he had found joy in the unexpected. The adventure didn't end when they returned home. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in John's life. He and Linda continued to explore new things together. They traveled to new places, signed up for cooking classes, took art workshops, and even started a gardening project in their backyard. Life had become an exciting journey again, and they were no longer waiting for the right moment to begin. They were making the moments happen. John also realized that his perspective on life had shifted in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent much of his career driven by the desire to achieve, to prove himself, and to accumulate wealth. But now, he saw that life's true riches were not measured in bank accounts or accolades. The wealth of life was in the people you loved, the experiences you cherished, and the joy of simply being alive. He no longer felt the need to work around the clock or to push himself beyond his limits. He had learned the value of rest, relaxation, and taking time for himself. He had learned the importance of being present, not just for others, but for himself as well. As John looked back on the last few years of his life, he saw them as a series of pivotal moments that had reshaped his understanding of what it meant to live fully. He had learned to prioritize his health, to reconnect with loved ones, and to embrace new adventures with enthusiasm. He had learned to let go of the idea that there was only one path to happiness and that it was never too late to change direction. In fact, he realized it was the changing of direction that made life truly exciting. The future, now, was full of endless possibilities. And John knew that he would embrace whatever came next with open arms, ready for whatever adventure awaited. He had spent his life waiting for the right moment, but now he understood The right moment was always now.